Steven Spielberg has clearly had a tremendous impact on the ufology community for over 40 years, merely with two movies made decades ago. Whereas E.T. the Extraterrestrial is obviously a Christ analogy story with a consciously opposite message from Spielberg's previous UFO classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is a potentially darker film than its early Spielbergian Pinocchio theme suggests. Curiously, the source material itself tells us what Spielberg does not in Close Encounters. And that is that, Pinocchio has some, not so fun, not so light and airy experiences that surprisingly are reflected in the Disney version of the story. But we're talking about Close Encounters, a film that is obviously influenced by certain themes in Pinocchio. Clearly a film depicting Enlightenment themes, it is interesting to look closely at Close Encounters of the Third Kind to find the little gems of esoterica thinly veiled as a post-1960s American tale of rejuvenation of faith. There is the obvious Pinocchio theme running through the film, which we are supposed to comprehend by Spielberg's references through the movie, visually and musically. Pinocchio being the story of the wooden puppet who desires to become a real boy and must prove himself worthy and make his creator/father happy. Throughout Spielberg's film, there are points of reference to the classic story of Pinocchio, specifically through the Walt Disney version of it. But there is deeper meaning to these references and some other points in the Spielberg movie that suggest the story of Roy Neary may not be, nor necessarily end, so joyously complete as the closing moments and music suggest. Generations of UFO enthusiasts may have misinterpreted what Close Encounters of the Third Kind may actually represent, for it is by no means the spiritual homespun fluff that is E.T. the Extraterrestrial. For the few on the planet who may not have seen this film or even heard of it, Close Encounters is the story of a common man who has an uncommon experience and finds himself on a quest he doesn't understand after seeing a UFO and meeting the mother of a little boy who is eventually abducted by unseen beings. Roy Neary is a husband and father living in suburban Midwest America. He has his 9-to-5 job that sometimes isn't, and does his best to provide for his family while entertaining his children through the notion of staying young and appreciating the wonders of their childhood the way he recalls his own. Neary's UFO experience alters his perception of reality and ultimately scares his children and estranges his wife. Dedicated to deciphering the strange vision of a weird mountain that plagues his consciousness, Neary and the mother of the abducted boy end up on their quest together, becoming part of a group of like-minded experiencers who discover a secret government operation which has led military and scientists along their own quest to welcome an impending visit from extraterrestrials. Neary and the boy's mother make it to the secret landing site and witness the arrival of the UFOs from another world, followed by their immense mothership and the return of all abductees taken over the course of a century, including the little boy. This is followed by the appearance of the extraterrestrials themselves and their communication with the scientists, which involves an invitation by the aliens to Roy Neary to come to their world. Neary accepts and is guided by the numerous childlike aliens to board their craft. It flies away as everyone watches with wondrous eyes, including the little boy and his mother, happy to be reunited. As the mothership departs back into space, we know that Roy Neary is on the adventure of his lifetime. Most people come away from this movie with a warm heart and a fresh curiosity about who may be out there. The film's impact on the ufology community has been clear for decades. UFO enthusiasts over a certain age imagine themselves to perhaps be Roy Neary someday. They hope the little childlike aliens will come from the stars and carry them away to a happy new world across the cosmos, all to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star. You can see this film's obvious influence on enthusiasts of the ET hypothesis since its release, especially among the ETs Are All Our Friends crowd. The subsequent release of E.T. the Extraterrestrial a few years later just served to cement that idea deeper into the ufology culture. It's not that the premises are original to ufology culture, because these two movies present themes quite familiar to UFO enthusiasts before their releases. It's the sentimental style in which Spielberg presents the material that was fresh and captured the imaginations of UFO veterans and newbies alike. Close Encounters could easily be the story of George Adamski or George Van Tassel, though it may be more akin to the weird experience of Woody Dernberger in the end. E.T. is obviously a Christ analogy tale, but it draws familiarity from the space brother angel claims long present in the ufology community by the time these movies were released. All Spielberg did was choose to tell these stories the way Frank Capra might have, instead of in the ray gun and flying saucer sci-fi pulp horror vein of the 50s and 60s. I think that Spielberg is mostly responsible for the tropes and assumptions found in the E.T. hypothesis camp of ufology culture to this day. Unfortunately, this camp is missing a major point inherent in the events and themes of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. First, let's consider the obvious biblical analogy between the two films. Just as he would later do with George Lucas in the Indiana Jones series, Spielberg tells an Old Testament tale and then tells a New Testament tale. Raiders of the Lost Ark is about the pursuit of the powerful relic device which the Hebrews carried through the wilderness, communicating with God and blasting their enemies with its power. In case you don't get the obvious, the villains are Nazis and all that comes with that. Then in the third installment, Indy goes after the Holy Grail, a Christian relic. In Close Encounters, you could say that Roy Neary is Moses. Haunted by the image of the mountain, he eventually goes to the mountain and has his spiritual experience with otherworldly beings, as did Moses encounter God. E.T. the Extraterrestrial not only throws the Savior symbology at us in the title character, with his heart light and going home to the heavens, it ends with the little boy staying behind with his mother, a Catholic Mary figure, you might say. In fact, it's quite a Catholic movie in this regard, I think. Spielberg's New Testament UFO movie. Not that there aren't New Testament ideas in Close Encounters at all, for consider the rapture theme. The scientist describes the experiencers as belonging at the landing site more than the government personnel. This implies an elect, which is further emphasized when we see the line of a dozen members of a special team groomed for the departure with the UFO visitors. But it is only Neary whom the aliens hand-select, gathering around him and taking him inside their craft, with his arms stretched out in a Christ-like figure, you know. Neary is the elect. He is the one worthy of being taken away to the heavenly sky city. The others stand there in their red suits, watching as the pure heart, the boy man, is selected for rapture to heaven. The team might even represent false prophets or other unworthies. Notice they are all wearing the big sunglasses, hiding their eyes, dehumanizing them. None of them ever say a word. It's the common man, the true believer from the unclean masses, so to speak, whom the Lord takes in the end times. That's Revelations. I'd like to point out, too, that, you know, a lot of you are all familiar with the Serpo story about we're told about the team of people that were sent off to the alien civilization. It has been my understanding, and it still is, that this didn't emerge until years after Close Encounters of the Third Kind had been in the public psyche, complete with its, you know, Serpo team of special selected worthy astronauts, you know, cosmic travelers in their jumpsuits, and on and so forth. So, yes, I think Close Encounters is the inspiration source for the bullshit Serpo story. So, anyway, on we go. Such Judeo-Christian nods certainly serve the inner emotional needs some in the ufology community have to replace traditional religion, as they are both familiar to a society raised mostly on these traditions and inspire a new yet comfortable version of the old ideas. That's what I think all this biblical symbology in Close Encounters also does for the audience. But that isn't where Close Encounters of the Third Kind is interesting for me. The biblical themes of these films are obvious, more so in E.T. In Close Encounters of the Third Kind, especially when it was first released, there was an element of mystery that inspired apprehension. I was 13 years old when the movie came out, and I very specifically recall the feeling which the original teaser and trailer manifested. It prominently featured a point-of-view shot of moving along an endless two-lane road through a desert expanse at night, the lines in the road illuminated by headlights. As you watched, the traveler or viewer speeds along this lonely, empty road in the middle of the night. The announcer describes the 3 levels of encounters with extraterrestrials. There are eerie scenes from the film cut in, but it was always the image of that lonely night highway that got me, and that I remember most. From the trailers, you had no idea that there would be anything like When You Wish Upon a Star in the experience. It was great. I loved the odd eeriness about it, and couldn't wait to see the film. It didn't disappoint my young mind, and had deeper impact than did Star Wars. I think I was too young to understand why. Other reviewers have pointed out the Pinocchio analogy with Close Encounters. Let's look at an analysis done by blogger Vigilant Citizen back in 2009. This is from Vigilant Citizen's blog, and I'm just going to share a few of the comments. It's titled The Esoteric Interpretation of Pinocchio, and if you go to vigilantcitizen.com, you can read this yourself. It's very interesting. Let me go down to the things that, first of all, it was written by Carlo Lorenzini, who wrote it under the name Carlo Collodi, between 1881 and 1883. Now, he was a political writer, writing political satire and stuff, but heavily political writer, and he decides to write this children's story, which has a lot more to do with mysticism than it does politics. So let's see. Here's an interesting quote that the blogger Vigilant Citizen quotes here. I'll read from the blog. Lorenzini's work was not solely political. His writings, especially L'Avventura di Pinocchio, contained metaphysical manners that are often overlooked by modern readers. One important fact needed to fully understand the depth of Lorenzini's work is that he was an active Freemason. In an essay called Pinocchio mio fratello, Pinocchio my brother, Italian Freemason Giovanni Malavolti describes the Masonic background of Lorenzini, and I'm quoting Malavolti. Carlo Collodi's initiation into Freemasonry, even if it cannot be found in any official records, is universally recognized and often referred to. Aldo Mola, a non-Mason who is generally defined as an official historian of Freemasonry, has expressed with great certitude the writer's initiation into the Masonic family. Events in Collodi's life seem to further confirm this thesis. The creation in 1848 of a paper called Il Lampione, which, as stated by Lorenzini, illuminated all who were teetering in darkness. He also considers himself a passionate disciple of Mazzini, a prominent Italian Freemason and revolutionary. So here's the author of Pinocchio, the creator and author of Pinocchio, who's a Freemason. Now, interesting that, of course, the most famous film version of Pinocchio is Walt Disney's classic version, and as we know, even though there is no documented evidence for Walt Disney being a Freemason, people still insist that he was. Yes, as I state in my book Latitude 33, he was indeed in high school in Demolay, but there's no record of him having actually, as an adult, become a member of Freemasonry. But, you know, whatever. But here is Collodi, Lorenzini is his real name. You know, this guy was an avid Mason, a Freemason, and you know, he writes this story Pinocchio, which clearly has Masonic themes in it from the perspective of becoming a whole man, a whole person, you know, from the rough Ashler. But let me go on with what Vigilant Citizen cites on his blog. Malavolti continues, there are two ways to read the adventures of Pinocchio. The first is what I would call profane, where the reader, most probably a child, learns about the mishaps of the wooden puppet. The second is a reading from a Masonic point Sorry. The second is a reading from a Masonic point of view, where heavy symbolism will complete without replacing the simple and linear narration of events. So that's pretty straightforward. Malavolti is saying, you know, you can enjoy the story, you know, superficially, or you can recognize its symbolic elements and really, you know, go from there. Vigilant Citizen writes, Lorenzini wrote Pinocchio following the long tradition of mystic texts, a simple narrative story that can be enjoyed by the masses with a hidden meaning reserved to those in the know. Exactly what I just was saying to you. So now, Vigilant Citizen gives an interesting analysis of the movie. He points out the differences between Collodi's book and the Disney movie. You know, meaning Pinocchio in the book was kind of a stubborn ass, as opposed to just the happy-go-lucky little boy in the Disney film. But they end up, you know, in the same ordeals. As Vigilant Citizen writes, the movie starts off with Geppetto, the Italian woodcarver. What's interesting is Vigilant Citizen considers Geppetto the Demiurge. Okay, the Demiurge of Plato and of the Gnostics. And as Vigilant Citizen writes here, the word demiurge is literally translated from Greek to the words maker, more specifically, artisan or craftsman. Isn't that interesting? An artisan. Geppetto is indeed an artisan. He's a toy maker, right? But it's interesting that word craftsman, because masonry is referred to as the craft. So Geppetto is this demiurge, right? This godlike being that those of you familiar with Gnosticism will know what that is. And he's the creator of Pinocchio. And this, of course, has its analogies in some folks' view of, you know, the creation of human beings, that we were created by some type of demiurge. Vigilant Citizen goes on, in philosophical terms, the demiurge is the lesser god, so to speak, of the physical world, the entity which creates imperfect beings who are submitted to the pitfalls of the material life. That's essentially us. The Vigilant Citizen's pointing out. Vigilant Citizen goes on. Geppetto's house is filled with clocks of his craft, which, as you might know, are used to measure time, one of the great limitations of the physical plane, and one of my favorite subjects, as you guys know. Vigilant Citizen, the blogger, quotes Manly P. Hall here. Out of the pleroma was individualized the demiurgus, the immortal mortal, to whom we are responsible for our physical existence and the suffering we must go through in connection with it. So Geppetto creates this boy, knowing that his little creation, his little fella's going to have to go through hell, right? That's basically what Vigilant Citizen is saying here. He goes on, Geppetto's created a great-looking marionette, but realizes he needs the help of the greater god to give Pinocchio the divine spark. And then, of course, you know, he wants his creation to be a full being, right? I guess a full human. But he, the demiurge, is incapable of doing this himself, as the blogger points out. And that's where the blue fairy comes into things, okay? She descends to Earth, and it gives that so-called spark. You know, this is the greater God being, or you know, possibly, as the blogger Vigilant Citizen points out, this universal mind, okay? And as Manly P. Hall says, quoted on the blog here, it was affirmed by the Gnostic Christians that the redemption of humanity was assured through the descent of universal mind, who was a great spiritual being superior to the demiurgus, and who, entering into the constitution of man, conferred conscious immortality upon the demiurgic fabrications. In other words, conscious immortality upon this puppet. And the blue fairy in Pinocchio represents that. And as Vigilant Citizen points out, the blue fairy gives Pinocchio the puppet life and free will. and I'm quoting the blogger here, Vigilant Citizen, although he is alive, he is not yet a real boy. Mystery schools teach that real life only starts after illumination, right? Everything prior to this is nothing but slow decay. When Pinocchio asks, am I a real boy? The fairy replies, no, Pinocchio. To make Geppetto's wish come true will be entirely up to you. Prove yourself brave, truthful, and unselfish, and someday you will be a real boy. So this is also very Masonic in its theme. I mean, it's obviously Masonic because in Freemasonry, the idea is to make yourself the better man, right? And being brave, truthful, and unselfish is part of that. But also you help other men to become better men. And that's where we get the idea of the Ashler Stone. And you know, it's pointed out here on this blog by Vigilant Citizen that the Ashler is equivalent to Pinocchio being made from the rough block of wood, right? That's Geppetto's version of the Ashler. So it's all very much a Masonic story. I will say that it's interesting that the fairy is blue because you have, I believe is it the Empress card in tarot? I think she's sitting on a throne, she's wearing blue, and she's seated between Jachin and Boaz. Now, Jachin and Boaz, of course, are very much prominent in Freemasonry. So is the blue fairy of Pinocchio, this, I think it's the Empress, I apologize, I should have had that information in front of me, but is it this same figure that's on the tarot card, seated on the throne between Jachin and Boaz? I think so. Let's see. So here we have the creator of Pinocchio, not to get too far from Close Encounters, but here we have the creator of Pinocchio himself as a Mason. Clearly he's created this story about, you know, the Masonic symbolism, and Pinocchio is supposed to, you know, become the better man through his ordeal and through his illumination, through a real boy, through his illumination. But like the Freemason becomes the better man through his ordeal of life, right? And the path that he takes. And in the story, we have some interesting potential parallels between Close Encounters and Pinocchio. And, you know, naturally, we get the visit of the Blue Fairy in the scene where Roy Neary first encounters a UFO. And that, of course, is when there's a UFO wave and the power has gone out. Roy Neary's an electrical lineman. Okay, so he's out in the middle of the night to get the power back up, and he stops at that intersection, and the UFO, all we see of the UFO initially is its approach behind him. You know, it looks like a rack of headlights. And, you know, they do this cute little visual gag that I won't spoil for you. But then all we see of the UFO after that is the bright spotlight just beaming down, the light beam from the sky. Well, that is a classic image from Enlightenment and Illumination, you know, art and sources and such, right? I mean, the symbolism couldn't be any more obvious. Well, that's the moment that Roy Neary is essentially given life and free will, so to speak, by the Blue Fairy. And the Blue Fairy is represented by the source of this light up in the sky. So off he goes on his adventure, right? Because this is the thing that sparks his awakening. Okay, and as Vigilant Citizen writes, this theme of self-reliance and self-improvement is strongly inspired by Gnostic Masonic teachings. Spiritual salvation is something that has to be deserved through self-discipline, self-knowledge, and intense willpower. Okay, we see this in Close Encounters, the self-discipline, right? We see Roy Neary focused. He in later he will build a model of the Devil's Tower, and you see the detail, okay, and the focus. That's a form of discipline. Self-knowledge. He's learning things about himself that he didn't know, but the intense willpower, especially of that. He's just obsessed. Okay, through his willpower, he pursues, you know, this enlightenment. He doesn't understand it at first, but, you know, and it eventually drives his family away, which I'll comment on further shortly. Just like Pinocchio, we see Roy Neary go through these ups and downs of this enlightenment ordeal. He might be in the middle of one at the start of the film. For instance, Vigilant Citizen points out Pinocchio is going through the temptation of fame and fortune, right? Okay, well, I don't know so much about the fame part of it, but let's say the temptation of fortune. And this is kind of thin and weak, but it is there. We see Roy Neary. The film starts out. He's a middle class, entering middle age, husband and father, living in Midwest suburban America, and he's got his 9-to-5 job. Clearly, his temptation of fortune is, I guess, virtually non-existent, or maybe he had dreams of fortune and thought this job, that he's now has was the way to go, and clearly it's just, there's no fortune involved. The guy's not rich or whatever. So at the beginning of the film, he's either successfully avoided the temptation of going for ill-gotten gains, ill-gotten fortune, and certainly isn't famous. So, I guess he passed that test. But we have to ask about the temptation of earthly pleasures. Remember when Pinocchio ends up on Pleasure Island, and is smoking the cigar and shooting pool and, making a jackass of himself, and literally becomes a jackass, if you recall. This is the temptation of earthly pleasures. Now, naturally, in a kid's story about a puppet that wants to become a boy, and then, of course, in the Disney movie, Pleasure Island is, earthly pleasures are going to be reflected in, Pleasure Island, a place boys would love, where they can stay up late and they don't have to eat their vegetables, and they can smoke and they can drink and they can just, be rude and crude and out of control, right? Well, in the adult world, the earthly pleasures are certainly, there's, Roy could smoke and drink, but we don't see any sign of him doing that. He seems to be a responsible husband and father. He's a bit on the boy man side, because we see the house is really greatly affected by his nostalgic interest. He's got the toy train, which he shares with his kids. He's, he's got the, cartoons playing, and he kind of. What's interesting about Close Encounters and the Roy Neary character is this is kind of prescient to the adult boy man phenomena we have today in American society, which to some degree all of us under a certain age, myself included, are guilty of that. I mean, I talk with my best friends, and we, this is a theme we discuss, that we don't feel anywhere near as mature as our fathers seem to be to us at the age we are now. I mean, my gosh, I'd been in a serious profession and all that from the time I was 24 years old, but I'm talking about in other ways. There were things about me at 40 that my dad at 40 just seemed not like an old man, just seemed much more mature. Okay. And, than I felt at 40. And, at 57, I just feel like my dad just seemed more mature. Most men that age just seem more mature at 57 than I think I am. But, let me get back to, let me circle back here to, what the point is, that the idea of the, the fun things that boys like to do and not have a care in the world and just do the fun thing boys like to do. This is kind of what the boy man can fall into with his nostalgia and wanting to be a kid all his life. And in this, we see Roy Neary kind of giving us a preview of what's to come in America. It's kind of interesting, but one of the earthly pleasures that could be hinted in the film, but Spielberg chooses not to go there, is I don't know if it's supposed to be suggested or if my adult self, when I was 13, I think I vaguely got this, I didn't miss it completely, but now that I'm older, let's put it this way. If Close Encounters were made today, Roy Neary would definitely have an affair with, oh gosh, Melinda Dillon's character. You know, the mom of the little boy who's abducted. You know, if the film were made today, they would definitely have an affair. Now, Spielberg chose not to go there with those themes, but when you watch Close Encounters, you could totally see how if he had, it wouldn't surprise you, because you know, it's just the circumstances and the way the story goes and how close they are through their experience and their ordeal. Watch Close Encounters, and I think there's at least 2 moments in that movie where, again, if it were made by another filmmaker or made today, those would be the scenes where they would, you know, make out or have sex or something. So let's go bring it back to the Pinocchio thing. Is the boy's mother, you know, a temptation of earthly pleasure to Roy, just like is he a temptation of earthly pleasure to her? But the story being primarily about Roy Neary, and we're making the Pinocchio analogy, we'll stick to the, you know, from the perspective of Roy. This is a married man with kids, and he meets this woman, remember, before his wife leaves him. So is there some unspoken energy? Does his wife suspect that he's having an affair with this boy's mom or with somebody, you know, that kind of thing? It's there. I think it's there. Is it thin? Well, yeah, but a lot of times, you know, what did I say a few minutes ago? What Vigilant Citizen, the blogger, points out, what the guy who was a contemporary, I think, of Collodi said also. You can watch the film on the superficial level, or you can see it with all the subtext. It's your choice, okay? Now, I think subtext, particularly symbolic, esoteric subtext, is one of those things that once seen, you can't unsee it. But anyway, I throw that out there. You guys could disagree with me, but this is what I think. I think that the boy's mom, the Melinda Dillon's the actress. Oh, by the way, Roy Neary's the part played by Richard Dreyfuss. But I think her character could represent a temptation of earthly pleasures, right? Now, as far as when Pinocchio turns into the donkey, the jackass, we know what that symbolizes. He's acted like a fool, so, you know, he's going to symbolically become the fool and suffer the consequences of that. And we kind of see this in the comic scene where Roy Neary is unshaven for days, in his bathrobe, real slovenly, and he's embarrassing the hell out of his wife and kids by going around the yard, you know, pulling chicken wire off of the duck pond and picking up dirt and ripping bushes out of the ground and throwing them through the kitchen window into the house. And then he goes and grabs the trash can from the trash collector and then dumps the trash through the window because of his obsession. This is Roy Neary becoming the donkey, so to speak, right? Becoming showing his ass, being a jackass. And you know, this is kind of the final straw for his wife. And but there we go again, another direct Pinocchio analogy, but a much more you know, it's not a cartoon, it's not this happy, you know, but kind of gothic, cartoony, gothic, dark amusement park. This is the real world. This is a suburban neighborhood with the neighbors watching as this man falls apart and makes an ass of himself and just mortally embarrasses his wife and kids. And this is not Pleasure Island, okay? So there's that. But as Vigilant Citizen points out, the donkey in itself, okay, is esoteric. Vigilant Citizen writes, Pinocchio himself starts to turn into a donkey, just like Roy Neary starts to be a jackass. In esoteric terms, he, Pinocchio, is closer to his material self, personified by this stubborn animal, than his spiritual self. This portion of the story is a literary reference to Apuleius's The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, meaning donkey, a classic work studied in mystery schools such as Freemasonry. So even that, you know, there is Masonic. So, you know, again, we have in Close Encounters an analogy, you know, to the Masonic donkey or the esoteric donkey, which the Masons embraced the symbol of. Okay, now, as Vigilant Citizen says, Pinocchio, once he regains his conscience, escapes the prison of profane life and escapes Pleasure Island. So, where does this happen in Close Encounters? Aha, I'll tell you exactly where it happens. Right after he makes an ass of himself and his wife and kids run off, it kind of dissolves into a little bit later that day, and he's filthy, dirty, muddy, and he's been working on the three-dimensional exact replica of Devil's Tower in his living room. Okay? I mean, it's over the top. It's ridiculous. And this is the moment when he sees the report at Devil's Tower that's on TV, and he makes the connection, and he realizes, oh my gosh, I understand this obsession with this mountain now. Here it is on TV. I've got to get there. That is the moment Roy Neary regains his conscience and escapes the prison of profane life and escapes Pleasure Island, like Pinocchio, to paraphrase Vigilant Citizen. Okay? So, seeing Devil's Tower on TV and realizing that's why all this crazy stuff is happening, that's where he needs to go, that is when Roy, the Pinocchio in Roy regains his conscience, okay? And then he's able to go on to the next step, which is, according to Vigilant Citizen, the initiation. Now, of course, Vigilant Citizen points out Pinocchio comes home to his father, the Demiurge, of course. The house is empty. He finds out that Geppetto has been swallowed by a giant whale. The puppet then jumps into the water himself and gets swallowed by the whale in order to find his creator. This is his final initiation, where he has to escape the darkness of the ignorant life. Okay? And he says the ignorant life symbolized by the womb of the giant whale, or the stomach, I guess, and gain spiritual light. Okay. There is definitely this aspect of Pinocchio in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I'm going to get back to that, but I just wanted to give you a little heads up. I'll continue reading. Vigilant Citizen writes, once again, Carlo Collodi was heavily inspired by a classic story of spiritual initiation, the Book of Jonah. Found in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, Jonah and the Whale is also read in mystery schools. Okay. Let me see. Let me get to the... Okay, here's... what I'm trying to do is find the things that directly relate to Close Encounters. So, at this point in the story, this is the initiation. He has to go into the belly of the whale, as they say, okay? And in the movie, Pinocchio, you see the Monstro, and he's got the big giant mouth, and it opens up, and Pinocchio is sucked inside, right? Well, the source that Vigilant Citizen is quoting writes, a huge storm arises, and the sailors, realizing this is from the Book of Jonah, I'm sorry. A huge storm arises, and the sailors, realizing this is no ordinary storm, cast lots and learn that Jonah is to blame. Jonah admits this and states that if he is thrown overboard, the storm will cease. The sailors try to get the ship to the shore, but in failing, feel forced to throw him overboard, at which point the sea calms. Jonah is miraculously saved by being swallowed by a large fish, especially prepared by God, where he spent 3 days and 3 nights. Okay? Now, this is where in Close Encounters the Pinocchio and Monstro and Jonah in the whale moment happens. You recall that Vigilant Citizen quoted the source as quoting the Book of Jonah about there is a storm brewing, right? When you watch Close Encounters, when the mothership arrives, it arrives in what? A storming, boiling, roiling cloud. Okay? There you go, right out of the Book of Jonah. Oh, and if you recall, in Pinocchio, it's a stormy night, I believe, when, or at least it's rough seas when Monstro's after him. Okay, and he gets swallowed up by Monstro. Well, the mothership comes down. Now, here's the thing. In the Jonah and the Whale story, they cast their lots and they decide to throw Jonah overboard, and he's swallowed by the whale. Now, in Close Encounters, you have that specially selected team, which Roy Neary is added to, you know, Richard Dreyfuss, and out of all the people on the team, he's the one that gets taken up into the mothership. Now, when you see the mothership door open, it's this great big giant door that's at the bottom of the ship. Now, look at the movie again and watch that, and that is Monstro the whale. That's the mouth of the whale opening up. That's Monstro, or the whale in the Bible, in the story of Jonah. And Roy Neary gets taken up this door, up the mouth of Monstro, into the whale. The mothership, it may not necessarily be the savior ship. It might not be a great experience that Roy Neary's going into. The mothership could be the whale in which Roy Neary's going to spend his symbolic 3 days of ordeal and torment, perhaps, and more initiation, more rough experiences. Okay. It's symbolic also when Christ is in the tomb for 3 days and is believed to have gone into the underworld. So everybody thinks that the end of Close Encounters is this happy, lighthearted, oh my gosh, he's taken up to the space people's world and the little aliens, and it's going to be so wonderful. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe that opening, that maw opening in the bottom of the mothership is the mouth of the whale opening. And now if it follows the story, he comes out on the other side of this ordeal, the better man, and you know, he's achieved his enlightenment and his illumination, and he's become whole. But you know, the experience that he'll have in the mothership may not be so hunky-dory. His ordeal may not quite be over when he enters that mothership. That's something that I would love to see Spielberg pursue, but I don't think we'll ever see him, you know, attempt to do any kind of movie like that again. But it would have been interesting to see, you know, a story about what, you know, where is Roy Neary now? What happened to him after that ordeal? But, you know, right there's your Jonah and the whale. There's your Pinocchio and Monstro. When Roy Neary is taken into that ship, that's the whale's mouth. So his initiation has just begun at that point. And what's interesting is we don't get to see that initiation. Okay? So the story of Close Encounters, really, as it's presented, is actually incomplete. Now, Vigilant Citizen goes on to write, Pinocchio went through the hardships of initiation and came out of the darkness of ignorance. He emerges from the tomb resurrected like Christ. He is now a real boy, so to speak, an illuminated man who broke the shackles of material life to embrace his higher self. So, this is, that kind of reflects what we see with Roy Neary. You know, he of course he's going on to his higher self. Of course his eyes are open and he's seeing things in a new way, but I don't think most people understood how much like Pinocchio this story was, or is, when you watch this movie. Of course, there's Pinocchio, I think there's a Pinocchio toy or something, and maybe a scene from the movie, but there's also When You Wish Upon a Star playing at the end. And he talks about, you know, hey, you want to go play goofy golf and go see Pinocchio, you know? So we are supposed to get the Pinocchio connection, but there's much more Pinocchio connection in the details of the story than I think most people realize. Certainly more than, you know, younger, you know, folks will get. Anyway, I recommend that you read. Let me see what he says in the conclusion. If I should. Okay, yeah. What Vigilant Citizen says here, in conclusion, seen through the eyes of an initiate, Pinocchio's story, instead of being a series of random adventures, becomes a deeply symbolic spiritual allegory. Details in the movie that are seemingly meaningless suddenly reveal an esoteric truth, or at least a brutally honest social commentary. So I think that applies to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, definitely. Let me go back to... So, yeah, go to vigilantcitizen.com and read the article on the esoteric analysis of Pinocchio and, you know, several others that are there as well. Now, as you can see, the analogy with Pinocchio can be taken into darker aspects most viewers fail to see in Roy Neary's Capra-esque dream as Spielberg presents it. Now let's look at a different angle altogether, which could marry the biblical with darker esoteric possibilities. Roy Neary's ordeal could reflect the less the Norman Rockwell vision of Christ's journey through the underworld, an episode you don't hear about in American Sunday school, I can assure you. I should say it was the lesser Norman, just the non-Norman Rockwell vision of Christ's journey through the underworld, let's say. Isn't it interesting that the beings from the heavens come down to Devil's Tower in Close Encounters to take one person back up with them? Is this God's angels retrieving Christ from hell after his 3 days? In the belly of the whale, you know, in Pinocchio's case, in the mothership, in Roy Neary's case, okay? More specifically, Roy Neary could be enduring a fall into the occult underworld. The occult underworld, I should say. Consider the mountain which haunts Neary throughout Close Encounters. It's Devil's Tower. Now, another reviewer of the film makes an interesting point about Devil's Tower. Let me find what happened to this. Okay, this is let me find who this is. This is Close Encounters Explained, a few keys to the esoteric meaning of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a French blogger whose name I can't seem to find here. I apologize. A French blogger, but the site is closeencountersexplained.wordpress.com. Okay, and in this, the blogger writes, Symbolism of the Mountain. Now, this is Devil's Tower in Close Encounters. But the way of the seeker fascinated by this superhuman promise differs radically from traditional spirituality. It is about truth, transparency, and human relationships that will free vital impulses and, as a consequence, liberate consciousness from animal conditioning. This mind control device is represented by the army in the story. It is a self-centered megalomania. It seems a left-hand path, mundane and carnal, as a Satanist would describe it. The meeting place with the ET is called Devil's Tower, and the musical theme of the mountain uses an interval called Diabolus in Musica, the devil in music. Now, isn't that interesting? Okay, the meeting place, as the blogger writes, the meeting place with the ET is called Devil's Tower, as we know, and the musical theme of the mountain itself uses an interval called Diabolus in Musica, the devil in music. Now, I'm sure that John Williams probably did that on purpose because the name of the place, right? But it's interesting also when you think of Diabolus in Musica that the communication between the extraterrestrials and the humans is through music. Could you, for argument's sake, for the, no pun intended, devil's advocacy argument, could you say that this is a cute little clue that these beings represent little devils, and the fact that they're communicating through music is a way to come across as pleasing, and how music is pleasing to the ear, and evil likes to be seductive, the dark side likes to be seductive, so why not use pleasant sounds to the ear, and that would be music? Could that not be a Diabolus in Musica, a devil in the music? You know, it's interesting, you know, to think about. The blogger goes on to, point out some of the things I did about, the breakdown of Roy Neary and tearing apart his yard and driving his family away to build this mountain. Okay, and anyway, it's interesting, this Diabolus in Musica thing, because they end up using music to communicate. So I don't know. I just thought that was kind of an interesting little thing there to point out with Close Encounters. Now, with this whole thing with the Devil's Tower, this obsession intrudes upon Neary's life. Okay, now remember I asked, what if Roy Neary is experiencing a fall into an occult underworld? Okay, what if somehow he invited something into his life, or it intruded on his life? Okay, this obsession intrudes upon Neary's life, alienating him from his wife and children, ultimately driving them away as it breaks him down. This is Roy Neary being reduced to prima materia so he can be reconstructed by his ordeal and those putting him through it. There is nothing enviable about what this obsession does to the man's life. Only the naive, the film's main target audience, do not see anything but a poor, misunderstood man who's a boy at heart. What's really happening is that beings from another reality than his own have forced themselves into his life and will not take no for an answer. Once Neary drives his family away, his breakdown is complete, evident by his disheveled condition, and the mess he has made of his home by building a replica of the Devil's Tower in his living room. The model of the mountain represents the building of an idol, and the materials he uses to build it, dirt, mud, trash, flora, represent Dionysian forces controlling him. At this point, Roy Neary has become possessed by the obsessive transmission from his new overlords. He wants to do their bidding. He wants what they're dangling. From this perspective, contact with ETs isn't very appealing. Think about the scene where the little boy is abducted by unseen aliens. They don't stand calmly by their craft with an inviting smile offering a pleasant ride. We see the boy pulled through a door forcefully, despite his mother struggling to keep a grip on him. This is after they've raided the home and ransacked it. Neary's luring by them to their side is more passive, yet every bit as aggressive when you see what it does to others in his life and himself. You might say Spielberg wasn't sure what kind of movie he was making when you consider the stark difference between what we see through the film and what we see in the climactic final sequence. Why would benevolent beings fuck with people like that if they truly mean us well? You could argue that they are tricksters. And part of that experience is growth through a test of patience and perception. No worthy growing experience is going to come without trepidation and pain, be it emotional or physical. Perhaps these characters perceive the events in the film as spooky and mysterious simply because they don't understand that which they have not yet seen the face of. Personally, my experiences in the realm of what I think is some sort of illumination have definitely involved spooky, eerie episodes and phenomena. So maybe Close Encounters represents both sides of the road to illumination. Just as its original promotional image shows us, a lonely road in the night with a brilliant light at the end. That sums up the journey of enlightenment, really. It is usually a lonely road through the darkness of mystery with the objective of the light at the end, i.e. illumination. Was Spielberg punking us? Was he actually using a veil of Capra over an ulterior Kubrick, and the initial spooky trailer was his wink or his revelation of method? Was Close Encounters of the Third Kind perhaps Spielberg's career-making ritual? Was it made clear to him that he had to make this film to have a shot at what he became, like Guy Woodhouse in Rosemary's Baby? Who might have been behind such a thing? Back in the early 1980s, I recall going to a movie with a couple of friends. One of these friends was a guy named Keith Shartle, who I had met in a film club a few years before. He had since gone to work for DreamQuest, a special effects house started by friends of his who had worked on Close Encounters. Keith told us that an unnamed person involved with the accounting on Close Encounters claimed that U.S. government money went into the movie production. This was in the early 80s, folks, that we were told this. It should be noted that Keith's father was Paul Shartle, who ran the U.S. Air Force audiovisual headquarters at Norton Air Force Base and had been directly involved in both Linda Moulton Howe and Jacques Vallée being invited to view U.S. Air Force film footage of an alleged real UFO landing. I cannot prove what Keith said is true, and I think neither could he, but it is interesting that someone else in the UFO community told the same story. Let me go to that. I made some notes here in the Bruce Ruck's book, Hollywood versus the Aliens. This was a book going back to the 90s. I think you'll find it interesting. You should check it out. But Bruce Rucks writes on page 168 of Hollywood versus the Aliens that Jenny Randles was told by a high-ranking establishment figure at the House of Commons bar, after talking to a gaggle of lords, barons, and MPs on the subject of UFOs days before Rendlesham Forest. Though he was credible, she didn't believe what he had to say at the time, treating it as a joke. He had claimed perfectly seriously that there was an education program afoot at the official government level to gradually release the truth about UFOs, that the world had to be prepared, which necessarily took some time. He claimed, this is Randall's source, he claimed that films like Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind were part of that program, financed, he said, by the right money being placed in the correct hands at the appropriate time. On later reflection, Randles considered it may well be true. Now, isn't that interesting? This comes out in a book in the 90s. You know, he says this before Rendlesham Forest happened, which I think was in 1980. And, you know, I'm told the same thing just, you know, a couple of years after that. Now, I'm not aware of, honestly, of that being published, you know, back then for my friend Keith to have known this Randall story, and he was just pulling our legs. I guess it's possible because I'm sure he was interested in UFOs, being that his father, Paul, was, you know, kind of has a role in interesting history of, you know, UFO stuff, right? So he might have been aware of this, but, you know, I just thought it was interesting that in this book, published in 97, that, you know, there would be that story kind of corroborating, at least hearsay-wise, you know, the same thing. Now, this has long been discussed. This is not new now. You know, people have talked about, you know, the times when government money has gone into entertainment and things like that. We know this. This has been discussed. You know, Jay Dyer discusses it. Rob Ager discusses it. But you know, that's my little thing. I was told that by Keith, and Jenny Randles was told, you know, the same thing, specifically connecting Close Encounters to it, you know, by someone else. Let me see if there's something else here that I want to... Oh, and this is the other part about the money that Bruce Rucks writes on page 492 of his book, Hollywood versus the Aliens. Get this. Given the $20 million spent by Jimmy Carter on UFO research that was never specified, and the surprising number of ufologically related entertainments that came out in the apparent educational program, the likelihood that this money was invested in Hollywood seems ever greater. It is worth noting, remember, $20 million spent by Jimmy Carter for UFO research that was unspecified. It is worth noting, Rux writes, that the budget for Close Encounters of the Third Kind was ultimately capped at exactly Carter's figure, $20 million. So, might Spielberg have been given the green light to tell his UFO story by the U.S. government, as long as he included what they required? Which of the several screenwriters who had worked on the film contributed the obvious mystical elements? Was it Spielberg himself? The likelihood of an uncredited contributor actually putting these elements into the story runs high, as that happens all the time. Writers contribute for money without screen credit. It makes more sense in this case if these elements are indeed intended. I think they are, of course. Personally, I think this more layered take on Close Encounters of the Third Kind makes it a far more interesting film and further reinforces my opinion that it is the superior and more important film than E.T. the Extraterrestrial, where ufology is concerned. What Roy Neary goes through in this movie is much more like the true reported experiences people have with the phenomenon. More people in the ufology community need to watch the film, and again if they haven't seen it in a while. If you see anything I may have missed, by all means put it out there. I'm interested in your take. Oh, and by the way, the original theatrical cut is the one worth watching. The special edition and the director's cut bring nothing extra but disappointment. But this is just what I think. Thanks for, listening in, and I will be back live next Sunday night. And you guys have a good night.